The early 2000s were a very interesting time for Spider-Man. After the relative failure of the unusual Spider-Man Unlimited, Marvel began to take a much more straightforward approach developing their next animated series. They tasked Brian Michael Bendis to directly adapt his own very successful Ultimate Spider-Man comic book run. However, after the unprecedented success of Sam Raimi's live-action Spider-Man film in 2002, they decided to rework the series to become a direct follow-up to that continuity. What resulted was Spider-Man the New Animated Series, a very ambitious and very different kind of Spider-Man show. And while I believe that in most ways it fails in its conceit to be a follow-up to Raimi's film, when taken on its own merits, there is a ton to love about the show. So join me as I swing through MTV's short-lived and wildly different Spider-Man series, Spider-Man the New Animated Series. After the production for Spider-Man the New Animated Series shifted gears from Bendis' adaptation, they hired writer Morgan Gandel of Star Trek The Next Generation fame to redevelop the stories with Raimi's continuity in mind. Allegedly, there was a pilot produced of Bendis' version, and I'd love to see that one day, but as of now, it's never been made public. This time, the series used 3D animation to bring Spidey to life, and as the show was produced in the early 2000s, this is very clearly the weakest aspect of the show. There's no getting around it. This was such early CG, and the character models, while impressive for the time, don't always look right. So many angles and movements make the characters' bodies look wonky and unnatural. Look at Spidey hold his arm around MJ's waist here. Forearms are not supposed to be opposable. Even his neck length and the way his head moves off the top of it is very uncanny. But nothing beats this one. Here's Spidey in a pretty typical Spidey pose, but my god, that ass will haunt my nightmares.
Feels like I'm wearing nothing at all. Nothing at all.
But for all of the CGI's obvious flaws, they actually put a ton of creativity into its design and lighting that kind of prevents it from being too horrendously dated. I found myself wildly impressed by their creative choices more often than not. For one, the show is cel-shaded, which prevented it from aging much more poorly than it actually did. They would also often flood areas with hard neon lighting that created a super cool color palette and helped hide some of the CG deficiencies. They used lighting to their advantage a lot of the time when they could. This sequence on a darkened subway car had some super creative camera movements too. This incredibly quick shot where Peter changes into his Spidey costume while there's a strobe light going off is so cool. I had to rewind to watch it again. There's just a ton of cool moody neon lighting and so many of those neo-noir style window blind shadows. Is there a name for those? Anyways, love them in this show. For a show that looks like, well, like this, I couldn't believe how often I was wowed by their visual choices. Interestingly, they also rendered the show in a 1:78:1 aspect ratio, a widescreen ratio where just about every other cartoon at the time was still produced in 4:3, maybe to try and present the series as more cinematic, with a closer aspect ratio to the films. The show airing on MTV also came with its own set of pros and cons. In the pro column, they were able to get away with more mature imagery and themes that wouldn't have flown for the Saturday morning cartoon versions of Spidey. There's a ton of innuendo and heavy implications on the romance side of things. They even do some swears.
All gonna be on your midterm.
I've heard her midterm is a real bitch.
In the con column, they were kind of strict about who the focus of the show was because of MTV's reputation. They want cool young characters, which means no Aunt May, limited Jonah Jameson, you get the idea. They put the major focus on Peter, Harry, and MJ as they start their college careers at Empire State University, which I actually do like. Focusing on them as a friendship trio while they attend college together is one of the things that really works about this series. However, it also, in my opinion, conflicts pretty strongly with the tone and setting of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man film. The entire pitch here and reason they redeveloped the show was to adhere to that continuity, to make this feel like a follow-up to that film. For one, the characters are not much like their Raimi counterparts. Neil Patrick Harris gives a great performance as Peter/Spidey, but he never feels quite as dorky or awkward as Tobey Maguire. This version of MJ embraces a much cooler, sexier, popular girl vibe, while Kirsten Dunst always felt a little more girl next door. And Harry, well, the performance couldn't be further from Franco, and the design wasn't even trying to look like him. I had no idea this was supposed to be Harry at first. And uniting all three of them at Empire State University doesn't really line up with what we know from Raimi's film either. We know they all started school in the middle of that movie, and that Harry and Peter move in together, but we also see an entire scene where Peter runs into MJ for the first time in clearly a while. It doesn't even seem like they've crossed paths since high school, let alone attend the same school together. At the end of Spider-Man, MJ confesses her love for Peter Peter, and he pointedly turns her down because of his responsibility as Spider-Man. But the entire duration of the series, they're portrayed as on again, off again. They kiss at the end of the very first episode, and this isn't really shown to be something that Peter is conflicted about based on his decision at the end of the first film. It's played more like your typical Spidey stories, where Peter is just really bad at being there for a love interest because he's always running off to be Spider-Man. Ultimately, I think lauding itself as an attempted continuation of the film was a mistake. They mostly used small aspects of the film's story as a jumping off point and discarded the rest. The things that stick are Harry thinks Spider-Man killed his father.
You have no idea what he really is. Murderer.
And also, Harry and Peter live together in an apartment off campus, just like they did in the film. And that is about it. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing for what the show ended up doing. Using some of the ideas established in the film as the baseline does work well for a lot of the stories they tell. I just don't think it can really be seen as a sequel to the first film. It doesn't fit narratively or tonally. But I actually think the more mature college vibes lend themselves to some great drama and storytelling, especially on the romantic side of things. And y'all know I'm a real sucker for Spidey romance. But we'll get there. Another aspect of the show's broadcast that was not great is that they released them severely out of script order. In fact, to this day, the episode order on Disney Plus is the broadcast order. The DVDs showcase the intended script order, and you can find that order on the Wikipedia page if you want to watch it properly. It's how I opted to watch the show. But if you just tune in and hit play on Disney Plus, you'll notice some weird continuity mistakes. A big one being that the first aired episode, The Party, was intended to be the 8th episode originally, and sees the disappearance of Max Dillon/Electro at the end. However, he appears as a normal, unbothered college student in the episode Head Over Heels, which aired 5 episodes after The Party. It also felt like the series was hesitant to use too many of Spider-Man's actual comic book villains. I expect they were barred from using Doc Ock due to the development of Spider-Man 2, but over these 13 episodes, the only comic book Spidey villains we see are Lizard, Kingpin, Electro, Silver Sable, and Kraven. 5 isn't unsubstantial, but we also get an entire array of original villains that have suspicious parallels with existing Spidey villains. I'll dive more into those as we go through the episodes because there are actually some really great characters in the bunch. The series also just has an absolutely bonkers voice cast. Besides Neil Patrick Harris as Peter, Rob Zombie played Kurt Connor/the Lizard, Kathy Griffin and Jeremy Piven play these original villains, the Gaines twins, Michael Dorn of Star Trek plays Kraven the Hunter, Michael Clark Duncan even reprises his role as Kingpin from Daredevil, which honestly I thought was really cool. Keith David plays an FBI agent, Ed Asner plays the most obnoxious cop in New York, Keith Carradine takes on the role of J. Jonah Jameson, and I gotta say, though I historically love Carradine, he's a pretty terrible JJ. Just completely lacks the energy that J.K. Simmons brings in the first film.
Read my lips, Spider-Man. Do New York a favor and don't do us any more favors.
The series' first episode, Heroes and Villains, does a good job establishing the focus of the series. It opens immediately with Peter, MJ, and Harry hanging out on the ESU campus. That's pretty much the show's bread and butter. They show that MJ is chasing after Peter.
You can't run away from me forever, Peter Parker.
Shortly after this, we see Harry in Peter's apartment, and it establishes Harry's issue with Spider-Man.
Harry, I get that you think Spider-Man killed your father on account of he did.
But rather than opt for a well-known Spidey villain for the first episode, they introduce a sort of Robin Hood-esque figure named Turbojet. He seems to be inspired by a combo of Blue Streak and Rocket Racer, and honestly, a lot of the visual effects for his abilities look pretty cool. His streaking across traffic at high speeds, the sort of magnet suction power, all of these are visualized well, given the animation. The episode also makes the major conflict involve both ESU and Oscorp, as Oscorp has basically purchased an ESU housing complex to be torn down for their own needs, putting Harry in the crossfire between his school and his father's legacy. Eventually, Turbojet kidnaps MJ and Spidey saves her, which gives them a minute to catch up. They actually mention the kiss from the first Raimi film, and they're very flirtatious, but she basically tells him that she can't keep up the flirting because she's interested in Peter still.
Anybody I know?
I don't think he even knows.
Okay, maybe she's just being playful here, but if this is supposed to be a Raimi follow-up, she literally told Peter directly at the end of the first film that she's into him. It was very cut and dry. He would have to know. Regardless, I actually love the dynamic between MJ and Spider-Man in this series. Yeah, she's into Peter, but she's also obviously got a thing for Spidey, and their flirtations definitely come into play multiple times over the season. It's a really fun dynamic, and I think Peter feels a bit more free to lean into those flirtations when he's wearing the mask. Ultimately, Turbojet wasn't a particularly compelling villain. His Robin Hood shtick seemed to be largely performative, and he mostly just wanted the notoriety, but it was cool to see Harry make the right decision and save the building from Oscorp's greed. And at the end of the episode, Peter and MJ just straight up kiss, which kicks off the very on-again, off-again nature of their relationship. The second episode, Royal Scam, features Kingpin, with Michael Clark Duncan reprising his role from the old Ben Affleck Daredevil film. At the time the episode aired, the film was only like 6 months old, which is pretty crazy to think about. and I think he gives a really solid performance in this.
Poor little Spider-Man can't get no respect. What a rube.
The premise of this one is pretty bonkers. At the beginning of the episode, Spider-Man is approached by the FBI.
Your country needs you, Spider-Man.
But as it turns out, this was all an elaborate scam, Kingpin making Spidey do his dirty work and steal a computer chip for him, which is a premise I really enjoyed. It felt like a pretty unique plan. But the aspect of this episode I like the most is that it basically did its own version of what we would eventually see in Spider-Man 2, Peter struggling to make one of MJ's performances and letting her down. For one thing, given that it's a college-set show, I love to see how much this series focuses on MJ's acting. It's nice that she has her own thing and we see it explored in multiple stories, but over the episode, Peter fails multiple times to catch her acting showcase because of various Spidey incidents. Classic Spider-Man stuff. Social life in jeopardy because of your responsibility and all that, you know the deal. However, he actually does manage to catch her final performance of the showcase, so it's kind of nice to see him actually achieve that balance, at least for a moment. I did kind of laugh that instead of hanging with Pete, she goes off with this hot actor boy from the showcase though. Like, they literally just kissed in the last episode. I mean it when I say on again, off again. The third episode of the season is titled Law of the Jungle and brings in a longtime series villain, Curt Connors and the Lizard. As I mentioned before, played by Rob freaking Zombie. Wild. And it's kind of an interesting performance. Not sure I want to go as far to say it's a good performance, but he's got a really gruff voice that I kind of enjoy.
Please, go. Now.
Though I gotta say, I was not a big fan of the model they used for the Lizard in this. A little too much going on here. I prefer the more simple designs we've seen in other Spidey media.
Hey, Scaly! Know where I can get a little tail?
This episode does look pretty great visually though. It probably features the most noir style lighting, tons of light shining through blinds with harsh shadows, mostly set at night so it uses the neon colors of the city really often. Just a nice episode to look at for the most part. But also, my god, I did not expect this episode to end the way it did. Spidey is hanging onto a helicopter via his web on one hand and Connors via web on the other hand, and after the Lizard slashes the web, he just falls hundreds of feet and splats on the street below. Brutal. They just kill Curt Connors off in one episode. This show really did some unexpected and kind of grim things when it wanted to. The fourth episode, The Sword of Shikata, introduced what might be my favorite original villain for this series, Shikata. She's allegedly based a bit on Elektra, which kinda tracks, but I honestly found her to be so compelling on her own. She's a highly sought after assassin slash mercenary who's hired for $2.5 million by this businessman slash producer named Richard Damian to capture Spider-Man alive. The first time the pair face off is visually one of my favorite fight scenes in the entire series. Not only does it have some very solid choreography and dope slow-mo, but the entire thing takes place underneath this chain-linked sort of canopy, and the shadows look so cool on both characters as they fight it out. Over the course of this battle, Shikata realizes what a worthy adversary Spidey is, and there's this great moment where it really hits her.
Good.
This sort of ends in a draw, but Spidey seeks out Shikata the next day and she's meditating on top of a skyscraper, just completely reaffirming that she's a total badass.
You mistake me for someone who cares about dying.
And you don't?
The only thing that matters to me is honor.
But honestly, this isn't even the coolest thing she does. After realizing that she's far more interested in a real fight with Spider-Man than she is with capturing him, she returns the millions of dollars that Damian gave her and refuses to capture him alive, instead planning on fighting him to the death.
You continue to impress me with your character more than ever. I know it is our destiny to fight to the death.
She also cuts off Richard Damian's head, which is discovered by MJ, who's up for a part in one of his movies. Just absolutely grisly subject matter in this Spidey show. We also learn that she seems to actually be incredibly old, with her younger body being sustained by her sword. All around, just very cool stuff. Like, I would love to see this character again in some kind of Spidey media. Spidey and Shikata's final showdown is once again really well choreographed and ends with an incredible slow-mo shot where Spidey grabs her sword out of the air before sticking it in the ground and breaking it, killing her once and for all. But like the badass she is, she bows to Spider-Man before she disintegrates. God, what a cool character. This might be my favorite episode in the show. It's up there. And it ends with Spidey and MJ getting real flirty again.
But the point is, we make a good team.
Yes, we do.
They even kiss, which is funny given that just 2 episodes ago, MJ was specifically telling Spidey she's into Peter and doesn't want to continue their flirty dynamic. But you know, I guess ultimately they're horny college students, and as you might expect, they think like horny college students. students. The 5th episode is another interesting one, introducing a character named Talon, who seems to be most closely paralleled with Black Cat, not in design, but in crime style, and also Spidey flirtation. Also, Talon is played by actress/rapper Eve. This series cast really just went for it.
Best dressed? Please, the girl's got hips like snack trays.
And yes, she is stealing an MTV Movie Award. The big dynamic shift for this character is that her real-life alter ego, Cheyenne, starts dating Harry, and Harry really likes her. But Peter recognizes her as Talon because of their tango as Spider-Man. But because she wouldn't recognize him, he has to play coy and press her without giving himself away. It's all a really fun and dramatic dynamic. I really enjoyed it. There are also just some really great friend moments between Harry, Peter, and MJ in this one, like when he tells them about Cheyenne for the first time.
I actually like this one.
He's not kidding.
I don't think he is.
She's also kind of flirty with Spider-Man when they're swinging through the city together, which again feels very reminiscent of his swings with Black Cat and other Spidey media. But Spidey has to also play coy with Talon when he's Spider-Man and not give away that he knows more about who she is. He's got to protect his friend while also protecting his own identity. It's good stuff. Sadly, she leaves town and breaks Harry's heart at the end of the episode. I expect if the show had continued, she probably would have made a return, but I'm glad we got this episode out of it at least. The 6th episode of the season, Tight Squeeze, introduces who I found to be the funniest villain of the entire series. Not in like an intentional way, I don't think. But these dudes are these jetpack wearing like KGB agents, and everywhere they go, they introduce themselves to everyone.
Allow me to introduce ourselves. We are Pterodax, a name given us affectionately with a nod to our winged dinosaur friends.
It is so funny. It happens multiple times. Like, just be a villain.
Employees of Empire One, for those of you who missed your own station's news coverage, we are Pterodax.
The pterodactyl thing is weird because it's not like these outfits actually share anything in common with one. They were allegedly a vulture replacement, which I guess makes the pterodactyl thing make a little bit more sense conceptually, but where they landed on it with the outfits, it's just so different. I don't really get why they went with the pterodactyl name. But the best part of this episode is its introduction of Indira Daimonji, a new original love interest for Peter. She's an intern at the TV station and a prospective journalist. Peter and Indy have instant chemistry and end up Pterodax's hostages together, leaving Peter to have to try and sneak away to save the day.
You're supposed to meet your future mate in the workplace. They never say anything about dying there with him. Oh, I can't believe I just said that.
The episode ends in a perfectly dramatic fashion as both MJ and Indy realize Peter is okay, but Indy gets to him first, kissing him right in front of MJ, which leads to a ton of will they won't they drama between all three of them for the rest of the season. But Peter and Indy's dynamic for the remainder of the show is one of my favorite aspects of it. Since Indy is an aspiring journalist and Peter is a photographer, they team up trying to break cases together when they can. But sometimes Peter just uses their leads to do Spider-Man sleuthing, so sometimes you've got scenarios where Indy is sort of feeding Spidey advice while he goes out and does his hero work. It actually plays a lot like Peter and MJ's dynamic in the Spider-Man PS4 game, but they're also very flirty. They get away with a lot on MTV.
Swing your butt over to Empire One. I've got something very hot and juicy for you.
The show handles a lot of subject matter you wouldn't see in a typical Spidey cartoon. The episode Head Over Heels features a woman who has a massive parasocial connection to Spider-Man. Granted, she's a little loony to begin with, trying to use her ESP helmet to read Peter's mind and all that, but she basically starts hallucinating Spider-Man, who tells her what to do in order to be with him. I love the angle that a character is an obsessive Spider-Man superfan. It's a little like what they did with Max Dillon in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but just dialed up a bit. Actually, speaking of Max Dillon in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, it actually feels like this series version of Max was a bit of a precursor to how they handled Electro in that film. I know the blue Electro originated in the Ultimate Spidey comics, so that didn't start here, but this series made Max a bit of a social outcast, an awkward guy who really just wants to make more friends and be popular. It's a different but still similar angle to Max wanting to be Spidey's friend in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Max's story is pretty tragic in this series. He's nearly murdered at the beginning by some frat jock's horrible prank, and then he's still horribly hazed at their party later in the episode. Max runs away from the party and transforms into Electro via this giant neon sign, and visually the transformation is pretty cool, but my god, he comes back to the party and he just straight up murders his bully. The episode ends with Peter, MJ, and Harry standing over that guy's grave. Max actually comes back a few episodes later too, and he fully goes for a Bride of Frankenstein thing, trying to turn his crush into another electric entity so that he doesn't have to be alone. Seriously, a tragic character. Flash Thompson makes an appearance in one episode called Flash Memory, and man, Devon Sawa's performance is so funny. They hone in on the Flash loves Spidey but hates Peter thing really well. I loved this reaction when Peter agreed with him about Spider-Man.
Back way off, Parker. I don't need you agreeing with me.
This episode is actually really fun. The premise is that Flash is taking part in a science experiment that will make him smarter, initially thinking it was a tutor.
Music be the fruit of love. Play on. Give me excess of it. That's surfeiting the appetite may sicken and so die.
But as it turns out, these chemicals, while making him intelligent, are also basically killing him. Of course, even after Peter saves his life, Flash doesn't give him the time of day. Pretty classic Flash/Peter stuff. There's also a Silver Sable focused episode that was pretty entertaining. She's generally pretty cool in how they portray her in this show. Plus, the episode has some great flirty scenes between Peter and Indy. Harry, MJ, and Indy all end up kidnapped, and the episode ends with a classic Spider-Man bridge scene. Man, he's just always getting into trouble on bridges, isn't he? But the end of the episode is great, with MJ coming to see Peter to confess how she feels about him when...
There I was, getting jealous. That's just not right.
Hey, MJ.
And boy, does this set the stage for the absolute crown jewel of this series, the two-part finale, Mind Games. This focuses on a pair of twins, original characters named Roxanne and Roland Gaines, who have incredible psychic powers that they can use to manipulate people into doing their bidding. The episode starts with them nearly escaping from an armored prison vehicle when Spidey swoops in to stop them. They try to control him too, but he seemingly gets past it and apprehends them. The rest of the episode features Silver Sable and Kraven attempting to get revenge on Spider-Man. The series implies that Kraven was put in the gulag after his previous tango with Spidey, which is interesting. None of the other classic Spidey villains have off-screen history with Spider-Man in this show, but Kraven does. The other thing that happens is that Indy and MJ confront Peter together about choosing who he wants to date.
Life is all about making choices. It's called growing up.
There's no 2-for-1 special, Petey.
And eventually, this leads Peter to make his decision. Since MJ has a thing for both Spidey and Peter, he actually reveals his identity to her.
Spider-Man?
It's time you knew.
You trusted me enough to tell me the truth.
But immediately after this, Kraven shows up out of nowhere and he straight up kills Mary Jane. The moment Peter revealed his identity to her, she was killed and she dies in his arms.
Peter, I'm so happy.
Throughout various points in this episode, you see these flashes of Spidey in this mysterious black space with his hands on his head, clearly in pain. And the big reveal is that none of the events of this episode after the armored car chase at the beginning actually happened. This was all the Gaines twins messing with Peter's mind, making him imagine an entire reality in which his love dies at the hands of Kraven. This puts Peter on a revenge-driven path to kill Kraven himself. As it turns out, Kraven was the one who killed the Gaines twins' family, and this was their way of getting Spidey to do their dirty work and get revenge on Kraven for them. I cannot say enough about how goddamn cool this episode is. Y'all gotta let me know if this idea has any precedent in the comic books because it kind of blew me away. Such a creative way to portray the psychic brainwashing. And the second part of the two-part finale goes even harder. Michael Dorn gives a particularly great performance as Kraven, and you get a little moment where he recognizes that something is up with Spidey.
More ruthless. No stupid comebacks or witty repartee. What happened to the wimpy Spider-Man I loathe?
But because Kraven implies that he hasn't seen Spidey since before he got sent to the gulag, and there's also a few other little pieces of evidence, Peter starts to realize that there's something not quite right about his perception of what's going on. He apprehends Kraven, but leaves to investigate, realizing that the things he thought happened to MJ weren't actually real. Turns out MJ has been kidnapped by the Gaines twins, and Peter asks Indy for help, and they hone in on where she's being held, which leads to the absolutely insane finale. After saving MJ and fighting the Gaines twins, Spidey appears to push one of the twins off of the building. But as it turns out, the twins use their psychic abilities to make it appear as though that was Roxanne, but it was actually Indira. Spidey pushes his love interest off of a building nearly to her death. My God, this show goes hard. Indy is in a coma and they have no idea if she'll ever regain consciousness. Absolutely insane. After stopping the Gaines twins for real, Peter goes into a completely justifiable existential crisis. Harry continues his anti-Spidey tirade, and even MJ, who stops by to see Peter and make sure he's okay, has turned on Spider-Man.
I used to believe in Spider-Man too. He let us all down.
The entire series ends with Peter tossing his Spidey costume into the bay, quitting his life as Spider-Man.
So it's time for me to say goodbye, Spider-Man.
Yep, the series ends with Peter having quit being Spidey and Indira in a potentially irreversible coma. Yet another Spider-Man series that ends without a real resolution. What is it with these shows? It's like the productions of Spider-Man series are as tragic as the character himself. The series was not renewed for another season at MTV, primarily because it didn't really fit in with their other programs, even though it had strong ratings. Not a ton is known about plans for seasons beyond this one, but director Brandon Vietti claimed that they would have used Mysterio, Vulture, and brought Kraven back if they had continued. And honestly, kind of a damn shame. I keep going into these Spidey shows expecting that they all were short-lived for a reason, but despite its incredibly dated animation, I found myself wildly impressed with the way the show handled its storytelling. It's easily the most mature Spider-Man series that I've watched, with absolutely brutal subject matter and much more mature tones and themes. It could have been so cool to see it continue. I still maintain that it completely fails in its attempt to be a sequel to the Sam Raimi film, and honestly that's okay, because using that story as a vague jumping off point actually led to some incredibly inspired storytelling. And even with the dated animation, they really were able to use it in ways that still impressed me, which I did not expect. Ultimately, this series was incredibly ambitious. The decision to base it on the live action film, that was ambitious. The decision to use 3D animation in 2003, ambitious. The more mature themes, those were ambitious. And some of these stories, particularly the Mind Games finale, were incredibly ambitious. I really thought I'd come away from this one with more negatives, but Spider-Man the New Animated Series pretty thoroughly won me over, and I think that it stands on its own in the long history of animated Spider-Man series.
Johnny Two-Cello!